Yes, hello again, and another warm welcome back to Classic Dirt Bike TV. Yes, hello to you all once again, and thanks for joining me here on Classic Dirt Bike TV as we head towards the end of another vintage racing year. But as we do that, we still have plenty of nice machines for you to take a look at as we finish 2024. And I do hope you enjoyed our last video posting with regards looking at that lovely outfit belonging to Mark Gibson, and if those three-wheelers are your particular scrambles bag, then stay tuned to my channel, because we do have a few more examples of those fantastic bikes coming up in the next few weeks and months. But right now it's back to the Terry Pickering Classic Motorcycle Collection, and we're going to take a look at one of the latest additions to Terry's big compendium of old school dirt bikes. And in this video here, we're going to check out his 1978 CR250 Honda Red Rocket. So let's take a look. Right, so it's back to our bread and butter of CDB TV with our classic two-wheelers again, and I do hope you enjoyed that Rind Tut Wasp Scrambles outfit that we showed you in our last video posting, because it's always quite nice to have a bit of variety when it comes to these old vintage dirt racers. So this time round we're back at the Terry Pickering Classic Motorcycle Collection, where we're continuing to have a look around some of the latest additions that Terry's made to his huge assortment of old school vintage racers. And this time round it's his 1978 Honda CR250 Red Rocket, which in a previous life was never really a proper bike at all, but this example here is another bike that Terry's put together from his mountain of old dirt bike parts that he currently has in his possession. But by now you're probably already aware about Terry's history and of how he's now retired, and he spends most of his time buying and restoring old off-road dirt bikes. And if he's not buying complete motorcycles, then he's usually found trawling his Aladdin's cave of rare and exotic bike parts so that he can rebuild and restore many of the long lost racers from back in the day, because Terry and his dad before him were heavily involved in motocross for many years. When Terry's dad had his own off-road motorcycle dealership in Ross-on-Wye in Herefordshire, and I think it was called Stormer Motocross at Prospect Garage. But Terry's dad certainly dealt with the sales, parts and servicing for many different makes and models of old race bikes, and although that particular dealership is no longer trading, Terry's still doing his very best to continue the family's connection with vintage racing by putting together his own collection of some of the bikes his father sold and serviced while the shop was in operation. And in this picture here you can see Terry alongside some of the nice specimens from his collection. Anyhow, so this bike here is yet another classic that Terry's rescued, and most of the bigger parts on this machine, like the chassis, the swing arm, the engine and the fuel tank, were all sourced from Terry's spare motorcycle parts warehouse, and although he did have quite a good skeleton of a bike to start its rebuild, he'd still have to scour the planet to find most of the other intricate bits and pieces that went into completing the finished motorcycle. But as with any other kind of bike restoration, it's usually best to begin with a chassis, because once you've got this part all sorted, you can then start bolting on all of the other parts onto it. And for this frame in particular, which is from a 1978 red Rocket, Terry simply lifted this frame off his chassis rack in his warehouse, and then he had it blasted clean to see if there were any repairs or welding needing carried out before it was then sent for powder coating. And as far as I'm aware, there wasn't any kind of remedial work required on this 46-year-old motorcycle frame, and so it was a pretty straightforward job of preparation and then painting the chassis and the swing arm and a couple of the other smaller chassis parts before that particular part of the Rocket's rebuild was then completed. And when you take a look at the chassis' finished condition, it certainly looks every bit bright and fresh as the day that these Hondas rolled into the UK in the late 1970s. But you can also see that these 1978 red Rockets had a relatively simple box section steel type swing arm, which is of course how these models came in that year. And as I remember, I think the 79 and the 1980 bikes also had these parts as well. But this swing arm more or less underwent the same kind of treatment as the rest of the bike's frame with regards blasting and painting, although nowadays you can also swap or change this original steel item for a much lighter alloy aftermarket part, which is actually quite a popular modification on these early red Rockets. But for me personally, I'm still a bit sceptical of those lighter alloy swing arms, which although they may be quite nicer to look at and of course lighter than the steel swing arm, then I always think that they tend not to be able to take the same kind of punishment as the stock steel arms did, and cracks and constant repairs were always quite common on those much lighter alloy components. But as we move onto the bike's engine, which in 1978 was an absolute revelation to the off-road bike world in that year, because riders and even the dealerships had never seen anything like these Rocket engines before, with their bright fire engine red paint and their compact engine layout. But once these bikes were put on the track and riders became aware of their performance and power, then it wasn't too long before there was a mass exodus of owners wanting to sell or trade in their Voltacos and Husqvarnas and Montesas and many of the other European race bikes, so that they could get a hold of one of these brand new motocrossers from Japan. And it's probably fair to say that with these red Rockets entering Europe in the late 1970s, then the writing was certainly on the wall for many of the smaller concerns that previously had dominated the off-road world up to that time. But when it came to actually sourcing an engine for Terry's 78 build, he did have an old but very tired looking example among his stock of spare parts. But rather than take on the task of dismantling and rebuilding and painting this 250 engine, Terry just simply decided to call in the experts, and he basically then just handed the old engine over to Chris Elderfield at Elderfield Motorcycles in Surrey, who are still without doubt your go-to red rocket specialist, who can supply parts and all of the other kind of services that you'll need to keep your rocket engine in tip-top condition. But Terry never actually furnished me with a list of exactly what Chris Elderfield Motorcycles did to this engine, but you can rest assured that this motor here is as good, if not better, than the day that it was made in Japan in 1978. And not only was this motor very compact and powerful, it only weighed around 56 pounds. And for a relatively small and compact engine, it certainly did have some impressive specifications, and I think it had a bore of about 70 millimeters and a stroke of 64 millimeters, and of course the cylinder also had a chrome plated bore inside, which was absolutely fine up until it suffered any kind of wear or damage, because unfortunately at that time you couldn't rebore these cylinders, so if you had any damage to the cylinder at all, then a replacement was the only other option. But to feed our 250 two-stroke with its fuel, it was usually a 36mm Kian carburetor that mixed the fuel and the air that was then fed through a 6-petal reed valve block. And if my memory serves me correctly, I think the engine cylinder had 7 ports with 2 intake, 4 transfer ports and 1 exhaust. And again, that Kian carburetor drew its air supply from a washable foam type filter that was located inside this plastic airbox, and normally the filter was easily accessed for cleaning and maintenance by simply removing the bike's seat, which again was only held onto the chassis by a bolt on either side of the bike's frame. Now, also our red rocket two-stroke motor also had this kind of head steady that was bolted onto the rear of the engine's cylinder head, and also onto the underside of the frame's backbone as well. But this wasn't just another kind of engine mounting as such. This, I think, was fitted to try and help dampen down some of the vibrations from the engine and transmit it through the frame, where it would then hopefully dissipate. Although if this system actually worked in practice, I'm not entirely sure. But moving on to the engine's ignition side, it was a state-of-the-art CDI ignition system that was used on these CR250s. Well, it was certainly state-of-the-art back in 1978, but nevertheless it was a tried and tested system that was super reliable, and that outer cover of this ignition, it was made of magnesium, which was quite exotic for its time. But it was still possible to make adjustments to the ignition timing on these rocket engines by simply slackening off the 3 bolts on the outside of this cover and then rotate it in whichever direction required to fine-tune the sparks to get the best from this superbly engineered motor. And also here on the transmission side, we have a wet oil-cooled multi-plate clutch, which was of course connected straight onto the crankshaft by a simple gear from the crank onto the clutch basket. So no rattly primary change to worry about inside this two-stroke engine. And in terms of gear cogs, it was a 5-speed gearbox, which you made good use of by using this alloy shifter to click up and down the cogs to keep our Honda right up there at the sharp end of the pack. And also to get your Honda engine fired into life, it was usually just a couple of short stabs on this left-hand alloy kickstarter that was all that was required to send you on your way. Now, for 1978, Honda were still using the side port exhaust on these 78 cylinders, where of course the exhaust expansion chamber header pipe wrapped around the frame's front down tube. And I think it was about 1980 when Honda came out with the twin spar down tube at the front to accommodate their brand new Red Rocket centre port exhaust on that particular model. Although the exhaust expansion chamber on our Terry Pickering Red Rocket isn't of course an original part, because you'd be quite hard pressed to find an original stock 46-year-old pipe nowadays. So this pipe here is a pattern replacement from Fresco exhaust, which is still more or less just a straightforward bolt-on substitute for that Honda original. And this tailpipe again is another high quality item, probably from Fresco again, which replaces what would have been just a simple mild steel made part from back in 1978, which would have probably been painted matte black, of course. But when that CR250 two-stroke motor gets fired into life, there's certainly a nice crack from this alloy tailpipe that you could only get from one of these highly engineered Honda smokers. But as we move on to the front end of our Honda, where in 1978 it probably would have been a pair of 37mm Showa suspension units, which again for their day and straight from Honda HQ were surprisingly good, although I don't think they ever had much in the way of being able to make adjustments to their rebound and damping, and I don't think they even had things like air valves in the top of each fork leg where you could add or remove air to try and soften or stiffen up the front end. But you could certainly, if you took the time, mess around with different spring rates or maybe different weights of fork oil to make minute changes to these forks' performance. But as I said, for your average club rider, these Showas were certainly better than many of the other motocross suspensions that were going around in 1978. And also to keep dust and dirt and moisture from entering those precious inner stanchions, Honda also added these rubber Gators to make sure that the inner workings of the forks were protected from all of the crud that these dirt racers encountered while they were doing their business on the track. But the rider still managed to enjoy, I think it was about 12 inches of front end movement on these Showa units. So again, for the late 1970s, that amount of up and down movement on a dirt bike suspension system was certainly unprecedented for that time period. Now, although myself, I was never actually lucky enough to swing a leg over one of these Red Rockets back in the 1970s, I do remember the bike testers in the magazines of that time telling everybody how good these old school drum brakes were, and words like excellent were commonly used to describe their performance. But this front backplate on this Honda was again made of exotic magnesium, as of course was this full floating rear brake, as well with its magnesium backplate. So it appears that stopping our CR250 wasn't exactly a problem, although having said that, the complete bike only weighed in at about 224 pounds, so it wasn't exactly a big heavy lump to bring to a standstill. And so as we make our way onto the rear suspension, where back in 1978 it again probably would have been a simple pair of Showa rear shocks on our Honda, which I do remember were a full 17.5 inches in length, and I think they gave the rider about 6 inches of travel at this rear end. But even for 1978, those original suspension units were still gas charged, but they didn't have things like piggyback or remote reservoirs to hold the gas and the oil. But again, like the front end of the bike, the rear shocks did work extremely well straight from the factory. And here in 2024, you're certainly never going to find a pair of those old 1978 suspension units. And besides, suspension technology has moved on in leaps and bounds since then. So when Terry started the build of this particular red rocket, he's opted to go for a pair of these very high quality YSS rear shocks. Although, generally speaking, the overall and rear suspension system, including this quite tough steel swing arm, were about as good as you could ask for on a stock standard 250 motocrosser straight out of the factory doors, and without making any tweaks or adjustments to the setup prior to putting this bike on the track, then this machine was certainly capable of putting your average club racer right up there at the top step of the podium. Moving on to the fuel tank this time, which, as you're aware, was still being manufactured in alloy back in 1978, as the much more popular plastic Honda fuel tanks were still a few years away as yet. And these nicely sculpted alloy fuel cells, as I remember, I think held just over the 2 gallons of pre-mixed fuel, which was usually enough to keep that reed valve 2-stroke Honda engine spinning around to develop the 36 or so horsepower that the red Honda power plant was alleged to produce. But these rocket fuel tanks were quite well designed and narrow enough to keep the rider's legs all tucked in nice and tight into the chassis, but they were also large enough to hold all of the gas required for even the longest of race days. But the overall look and aesthetics of this alloy fuel cell certainly fitted in superbly with the rest of the bike's immaculate lines. So when it came to sourcing a seat for Terry's red rocket build, I'm guessing here that this seat that's fitted to our CR's chassis is one of the parts that Terry had to locate from an outside source, because although Terry does have a copious amount of spare parts in his second-hand bike spares department, he quite often still has to buy in bits and pieces from across the globe to complete his rebuild project. So I suspect that this seat base and its foam insert were at least 2 of the components he had to locate to complete the refurb of the finished bike. And it looks like a brand new seat cover has also been added to complete this part of the machine's restoration. But as I recall from some of my old mates who were lucky enough to race these red rockets in the late 1970s, they told me that they had no complaints with regards the comfort and overall seating arrangements on these iconic red roosters. And by all accounts, this motorcycle seat did exactly what it said on the tin with regards comfort and overall seating position. And next up, it's all of the plastic bits on Terry's new bike, which, as you've probably guessed, are all brand new replacements, and parts like these side panels and things like the front and rear mudguards are just a few of the many pattern replica components that you can source for these Honda CR250s, which is another good reason that it makes these bikes such a good choice as a Twinshock racer, because parts like these are usually plentiful in supply, although as you'd expect, brand new old stock 78 bits and pieces aren't as easy to come by, but they are available if you're prepared to search and surf the net for exactly what you need. So whether these parts are original or not, these plastics are almost undistinguishable from the stock Honda items. And if you're not trying to build a 100% factory fresh look-alike and you just want a bike to race each and every weekend, then you don't need all of those original bits and pieces, and these remanufactured plastics are certainly a perfect substitute. But finally, let's make our way around to the pilot's end of our 78 Red Rocket, and as you'd expect, more or less all of the controls on this Terry's bike are all brand new replacements to what Honda bolted onto this bike in 1978, starting of course with the handlebars, where in this case here Terry's bolted on a decent pair of Ryken bars with its associated crossbar pad there as well. And although these Rykens are very good quality and probably better than the Honda originals, these of course have a much different profile than the factory Honda items. Now also some of the other little intricate parts like the handlebar grips are again brand new items, and these rubber grips are Italian Domino grips, which I remember are quite good quality items, and in normal racing trim these would be wired tightly onto the bar tubes to stop them coming loose or turning around when that rider was hanging on for dear life when the Red Rocket was strutting her stuff on the track. But other parts like these clutch and front brake levers are again alloy parts, as they were when Honda first built this bike in the late 1970s. But naturally they're lighter than the old school steel ones that you used to find on the vintage race bikes of the 1960s. But these alloy levers, although lighter, never seem to take the same kind of punishment as the older steel items, but some damage in terms of bending them if you drop the bike could be put right if you're careful when you're trying to straighten them. And once more, all of the control cables are brand new replacement items supplied by Ven Hill. And I'm also guessing that this throttle gasser twist grip here is another Italian Domino part. And even although this was just a relatively small Honda CR250, you still needed a steady hand on this throttle twist grip to keep that reputed 36 horsepower of the Red Rocket engine in its place, because the Red Rocket didn't exactly get that label stuck in it because it was a slow bike, and if you turned this tap onto full, then that Honda power would soon begin to flow. And so for a brand new model from Honda in 1978, you'd think that at the very least there might be a couple of things on this bike that would need further development or some kind of tweaking on this racer, but the actual reality was that Honda had certainly done all of their homework with regards design and construction of this CR250, and straight from the crate and onto the track without any tuning or any kind of adjustments, this bike could quite easily put its rider on the top step of the podium, because it was certainly that good, and it had excellent suspension on the front and at the rear, decent brakes of course, and a well-designed chassis as well. And of course that fire engine red Honda 250 two-stroke motor was an absolute stonker of a motocross power plant, even by 1978 standards. And as I mentioned at the beginning of this video, it's because that these red rockets were so radical and good at what they did. Many of the smaller European bike manufacturers of the day saw their sales of Bultacos and Micos and Huskies all fall as riders queued up to grab this latest motocross off-roader from Japan. And so from what wasn't actually a bike at all at the start, but just a collection of period-correct Honda 250 motorcycle parts that underwent some restoration and renovation, to then bring them all together to form this iconic rendition of one of the most influential off-road motorcycles of the 1970s. And so now Terry has yet another piece of motorcycle history to add to his very comprehensive list of old school vintage scramblers. Okay, so as we head to the end of 2024, we've got another little treat for some of the trials riders who watch my YouTube channel. So next time we'll check out this 1982 Italian Fantic 200 trials bike that I came across at the Scottish Motorcycle Show back in 2020. So if you're into your trials motorcycles, then make sure you return to take a look at this very nice piece of kit. So until the next time, thanks again for taking the time to watch my content, and from all of us here at Classic Dirt Bike TV, it's goodbye for now.